Hi, Anthony Barker back again, and today we're tackling some shop organization. Now things were just not quite how I wanted it in here, so we decided to tackle two quick projects just to improve our workspace. So number one is this rolling cabinet that we're made. And this is going to help keep some of the equipment, especially our painting stuff, because that's up in the rafters right now. It's just too much of a hassle to get to. The other thing is I wanted a good place to store my clamps. Now I don't have a great amount of wall space, so I can't make, I actually would like to do like a whole French cleat wall, but I just didn't have the space for it. So we came up with just the solution of just doing the small ones right here for these. So it really kind of helps keep things organized. And I'll be putting some timestamps below, that way if you want to check out one or the other project, you can kind of skip ahead to that. So let's get into the builds.
All right, so for these projects, I'm going to be making everything out of scraps or just extra pieces that I had from other projects. My goal was to not buy any new material, at least as far as the wood goes for these projects. So I got some scraps, kind of measuring my clamps here to see what size I need and making sure the pieces are big enough, and I start marking out where I think I'm going to need to cut them. And there are a ton of different ways you can get these cut out. Easiest one I thought for me was just using my cross-cut sled. So I just kind of basically cut them into good squares there, and then we just go ahead and turn them off to the side and just kind of line up the points there in the kerf of the cross-cut sled, and then I cut it there and it makes that triangle shape, which is going to be the basic shape for it. And then after that, I just turn them on the side and use a little spacer so I can cut off the edges, because I didn't want sharp edges on the points of these things. I just wanted to have a little bit of a more of a softer edge, so I just cut off those edges. And I honestly didn't have like much of a plan when I started making these. I knew the basic shape, and I just kind of made it up as I went along as far as the spacing goes. And then once I had that part figured out, I got the part that's going to be the French cleat, and I just got another piece of the plywood and set my table saw to about a 45-degree angle, and then just cut it straight through, and that'll give me the two pieces I need to attach that to the wall. Then now over to the router table, and I just put a small round over on all these edges just to kind of smooth them out a little bit, makes them a little bit more ding resistant. It just kind of feels nicer to the touch as well. Next, we're going to be attaching the holders to part of the French cleat. So I just clamped them into place, countersinked some holes, and then just screwed them straight in. And then I cut off that other little piece to use as spacer just to make sure it's nice and equal amongst the two different holders that I'm going to have. And I also want to mention that I don't have as many clamps as I would like yet, so my storage needs aren't too great, but of course it'd be easy enough just to kind of alter this in the future just to get some more spacing. And even with this original piece, I'm making it for more clamps than I have currently, so I can still expand without having to build something new. So next we're just going to attach it to the wall. So I found where the studs were and made sure I leveled it out and then screwed it straight into the stud. And that keeps it nice and sturdy, and it can hold all these clamps easily. And like I said, you can see there's space even for extra ones already now. So after I got those ones ready, it's time to make it for the smaller clamps. And for this, we're following the exact same process. I'm just making these a little bit smaller in size compared to the other ones, because obviously you don't need it as big for those. And as I was making this, I realized it's such a simple build, but it's so very useful just for my workflow. Because I was using like an old table to hold my clamps, and they were always kind of disorganized and out of the way, and it's just too much of a hassle. And kind of kicked myself. I'm like, I should have just did this sooner, because it's such a quick and easy build, but it really does make a difference. And just like on the other one, this one has more space than I need. So next I wanted to put for these other clamps. So this one, it didn't need the wedge to kind of hold it in there. So I just put a piece that goes straight out, and I glued it in place temporarily until I could screw it. And then I'm going to screw that just directly to the wall as well. And just that little bar is more than enough to hold these type of clamps in place. So with that project done, it's on to the rolling cabinet. So use this little plywood mover there just to get this over to the side so I can start cutting it down. And this is some pre-finished plywood that I had from a prior project. And so I just wanted to make sure I cut everything down to size, and I'm using these new setup blocks that I got to set up to put the rabbets on the bottom like I typically do on most of the cabinets I make. And I use the painter's tape on these just because that veneer on this pre-finished plywood is so thin, it kind of chips and comes off so easily. So that just kind of helps protect it a little bit just to kind of keep it nice. And then for these ones, we're just cutting on some extra pieces to use as supports. So I get those to width and then cut them down to length on the miter station. Next, we're going to go ahead and just drill in some pocket holes so we can get them attached to the cabinet once we put it all together. And because this is pre-finished plywood, I wanted to sand down these little edges where the rabbet joints are going to sit on. That way the glue holds a little bit better. Then we're on to going ahead and assembling the cabinet box. So we just go ahead and glue that, and then we use these 90-degree thingies to hold it in place as we're doing them. I always forget the name of those things. And like those are very helpful. It just kind of holds it in place, especially when you're doing it by yourself. I like to put them up on blocks, that way there's enough room to get those clamps in place. So we go ahead and do the other side, the same process. Just put these on there and make sure that it's a nice 90 degrees and it sets up well. And I do like to add some extra clamps just to make sure it's a nice tight joint while it's drying up. And after that's done, we're on to putting on the supports. Now I usually just use some pocket holes and some clamps to hold this in place until I secure it. You can also cut out some notches in the top of the wood if you want, just to make it set on there a little nicer. But this works out well for me, so I've been kind of sticking with that. And then I'll do that on the front and also on the back, and those will be nice surfaces to attach the top to. And then also doing the same type of supports on the back as well. And then once I get that in place, I usually kind of screw it to the one up top just to kind of help keep the structure a little bit more rigid. And we're doing the same one on the bottom. Now you can use these as nailers, but for this one it's not really necessary since it's mobile. And then also, just because it's going to be moving around a lot, I wanted a little extra strength. So here I am screwing straight from the bottom into those side supports just to kind of make sure it never moves. And next up, we're cutting out an 1/8 inch piece of plywood for the back panel. So I just glued that on and just tacked it right in place with these brad nails. And then after that's in, you can just come by with a flush trim sander and make sure it's nice and flush. And here again, I am using that tape just because this one was so thin, it kind of crumbled when I started to use it without it. So the next up is the top surface. Now I initially wanted to use a 3/4 inch piece of plywood in just a single piece, but I didn't have enough left, and like I said, I was just trying to use what I had on hand, so I just grabbed 2 1/2 inch pieces and I'm gonna go ahead and laminate them together. Now, they were bowed a little bit, so I set it up so that as I clamp it together, it straightens them out, so the bows were kind of creating a little bit of oval shape when they were attached together. But enough screws in there, and then this thing's never gonna move. So then I set it up on place, and then we'll just use some clamps to make sure it doesn't move while we're screwing in the top. And for the back, the clamps wouldn't work, so I just put a heavy piece there just so that would keep it still while I was attaching it. Then we come by with the flush trim bit on the router and make sure everything is nice and flush, because we're going to be putting some trim on here next. And for the trim, I'm just using some small pieces of poplar that I had left. So I cut them down to size, glue them in place, and just brad nail them in, and then we'll go in later and fill up those holes with some wood filler. And this one also was a little bit bowed, so I used the clamps to kind of keep it nice and in place while I was attaching everything and also while it dried up. Now we're going to be putting in the drawer slides, and we're doing undermount slides for these ones, and I got lazy and it didn't feel like just cutting out a spacer, which I really should have did. It would have made it a lot easier. So for this one, I just measured it and marked lines exactly where they needed to go and then screwed them into place. And we're doing 2 drawers on this one, so of course 2 sets. Then just so I can start moving this on the ground, we're going to add our casters. And for that, you want to make sure you don't drill too deep, so otherwise you can go through the bottom of this thing. So that's why I got the painter's tape on there. So I just drill out the holes, and then you can screw each of these casters in place, and then it's going to be ready to roll. So now we're going to start making the drawers, and I waited until I had the slides in place so I could measure the correct width for them. And then I got some of more of the plywood, and I cut down the pieces that I'm going to need for the drawer box. And like before, we cut it to width there, and then down to length over at the miter station. Then it's back over to the table saw. We're going to be putting in the little dado grooves for the bottom piece. So I'm using those setup blocks again just to get the spacing right, and of course the depth of the groove that I'm going to be making. And we're going to do this in 2 single passes. So I run 1 pass through each piece on the table saw with just the regular blade. Then I use a test piece, move over the fence just a little bit to be able to be the right size for the plywood that I'm going to put on the bottom. Of course, I did check that just to make sure it was right. And when I was happy, then I'd run all the rest of the pieces through the second time, and then you get the nice groove in there. And for these ones, I'll be putting in 3 pocket holes in each of the drawers on the front and the back. And of course, those will be hidden once it's all put together. But before we assemble, now is a good time to get it all sanded down. So I use my sheet sander just to kind of do all the box pieces. And for the bottom part, it's a little bit thinner, so I do that part by hand. Now we can finally assemble the boxes. So basically, I just glue all the joints, get the bottom piece slid into those grooves into place, put on some clamps so it doesn't move on you, and then you just go ahead and use those pocket hole screws to secure it. It's nice and easy this way, and then of course just repeat it on the same side. And I usually check it just to make sure that it's square as I'm putting it together, make sure I don't have to do any adjusting. But unfortunately this time I kind of forgot that I'm doing the undermount slide, so I forgot to cut out the notch that it's required for these ones. So after I got the drawer put together, I had to go back and cut them out, and that made it a lot harder to do than if I would have did it in the first place. But I got my jigsaw and I just kind of worked back and forth, and I got out the notch that I needed. You can see it right there, so that's where it kind of sits on the drawers. And then you also need to have a hole right above that, and that marks out where the little notch on those slides will sit into. And there's tools to mark these spots, but I usually just bang the drawer in place, and it puts a little dent in the wood, and that'll tell you exactly where to go. So then we can go ahead and put the other parts of the drawers here, and this is just going to be a part that's going to click onto the hardware and keep it in place, and you can also adjust the position of it a little bit with those as well. And of course, always got to test them just to make sure everything's working well, and once we're happy with that, then we can get ready to make the drawer faces and the cabinet door. So for this one, I just kind of measured it out and cut it out to the size that I want, and we're going to be using the concealed hinges for that. So I always get this Craig jig, which makes it nice and easy. It just drills straight down, and then you can use the little side holes there for the screw hardware. And it's as simple as that. And it does have a hard stop here, so you don't go too far into your piece and go through the other side. And I do like these concealed hinges because they're nice and adjustable, and so it gets you a lot of wiggle room if you don't get it exactly where you need it once you are installing it. So we get both of those screwed in place, and for this one, to install this onto the cabinet itself, I decided just to lay it on its side, and I can mark out exactly where I needed it, and then I just double check the placement with my tape measure there, and just screw them in, and then you can rehook it back on just to confirm that it's right exactly where you need it. And like I said, you can have lots of adjustments on that just to get it right. So with that in place, we're going to go ahead and get ready to do our drawer faces. So I'm screwing the holes for the drawer pulls here, and we'll use these to attach them. So I'm going to just put my spacers on top of there and set it just to make sure it has the spacing that I want. And once we have it there, we can just put in some temporary screws to hold it right exactly where we need it. Now, I wasn't quite sure about the size and spacing, so I waited till I had that one in place to measure it for the top drawer face. And now that I can confirm the sizing, we can get that one cut out and then put it in place using the same spacers as before, just to make sure everything is nice and uniform. And this time I made sure to take the painter's tape off first, because the other one I had it on the back, and so it was a little bit more of a hassle to get that tape off once it's secured to the drawer itself. So I get that in set in just to make sure all the spacing works out nicely, and then we can also temporarily attach this one through the holes that we drilled in for the pulls. So once that's in, then you can just go ahead and pull out the drawer, and then you can use some screws from the inside to permanently secure that. And then that drawer face is never going to move, and then you can go ahead and take out those temporary screws, and you'll use a backer piece, clamp it in place, and then drill all the way through that. That way you can install your drawer pulls. And I'm using these same black bar pulls that I used on all the rest of the cabinets that I've been making out for my shop area. So it's a nice cohesive look. And then for the cabinet door, I'm just using this little jig that I made up a long time ago that has the spacing I like for those, and then just install the same pulls on that as well. Then we can test it out and then make sure we just get a little minor adjustment just to make sure the spacing stays well. And we're getting close. So here, one of the brad nails didn't sink in enough, so I just use this just to push that in. And then, like I said before, we'll do the wood filler and then sand down this top. Now, we don't have to put finish on most of the cabinet because it's pre-finished, but we will have to on the top. And I do want an adjustable shelf in here. So I'm just using this jig and just a spacer underneath just to get the spacing I want. And we'll do the on the front and back on each side. Then after that, you can just throw the pins in and then the shelf is ready to go. And then we do have room for adjustment as my storage needs can change in the future. And then this part, when I adjusted it, it stuck out just a little bit. So I just used a flush trim bit just to kind of get it right. And then we can put on the polyurethane finish. And once that dried, the project was done and ready for use. And I'm very pleased on how it came out.
All right, and that's the projects for today. Now these ones were really quick and easy, but it does help out a ton to have these kind of out of the way and easily accessible. So it helps kind of keep things a lot better when I'm doing my projects. And for this one, I'm very happy how this cabinet turned out. It's got good space for everything that I need to store in here. And just like everything else, it's nice and mobile, so I can get it out of the way when I need to. Now we do have some detailed plans available if you're interested in this cabinet, so check out the links below. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in the next one.